Our first speaker today is Ms. Rachel DuFault. Ms. DuFault is an attorney and works as a copy editor for the Human Resources Library at Bloomberg DNA. She graduated cum laude from the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, with a certificate from its Institute for Communications Law Studies. She also holds a master's in journalism, with her thesis approved with distinction, and a bachelor's degree in journalism and political science, graduating magna cum laude from Baylor University. She is active in the American Bar Association, where she is serving as secretary for the Judicial Division Lawyers Conference, and is a co-editor of the e-newsletter for the section of litigation, Young Advocates Committee, and is a member of the section of labor and employment law. Please join me in welcoming Ms. DuFault.
Good morning, everybody. It certainly is. Can you hear me? Yes. Good? Okay. Good morning. It certainly is a pleasure to be here this morning with you here in Washington, D.C., as well as out in Richmond. It's really nice to be here and to kind of kickstart off this seminar to talk to you a little bit about steps for successful writing. And when I think of writing, I kind of consider it to be a journey. How do I get from point A, when I'm starting, to point B, a successful document? It kind of reminds me of when I was in college. I went to college in Central Texas, and I was living up in the suburbs of Chicago was my home. So during the holidays, every once in a while, I would make the 18-hour trek home driving from Central Texas to Chicago. And in order to do that, there were some guideposts and guidelines to get me along the way on the interstates. For example, I knew when I was traveling up on I-69 in Oklahoma, kind of by the restaurant signs as I went through, I could kind of tell when I was closing in on Muskogee and getting close to the I-44 interchange that would get me into Missouri. And once I hit Missouri, I knew that once I got to Joplin, Missouri, I had hit my halfway point. I would spend the night, stop, refresh, but I knew I was halfway home. And then once I got into Illinois, you hit I-55. And I knew once I got to Springfield, Illinois, that I was about 3.5 hours outside of Chicago. So I was in the home stretch. And then I knew once I got to I-355, heading into the northwestern suburbs of Chicago, I knew that I was pretty much home. And it was helpful to have those guideposts to help me know how I got from A, Central Texas, to B, home to Chicago. And with that said, and similarly, today we're going to talk about steps for successful writing to get you from point A, just beginning, to point B, having a successful document. So the first step for successful writing is what I like to call, and what happens in what I call the pre-writing phase. The first step is to know your audience. Before you even begin writing, you should determine to whom you are writing. All audiences are not the same and can require different styles of writing. For example, you might think of maybe, boy, I'm having difficulty this morning. You might be asking yourself, well, am I writing for a partner or a firm? Am I writing for a client? Am I writing for a judge? Am I writing for an article for publication? Well, let's take the first example. Am I writing for a partner or my firm? If you're writing for a partner or a firm, the style of your writing should reflect the partner's and firm's preferences. Does the partner and or firm have a certain style of writing? For example, is it sufficient to write an informal memo? Or do you need to follow a formal template? Or can you respond via email, text, or IM? Well, I know in my experience when I work with my editors, they know that I prefer to get, if I can, information via email electronically. I get so much paper, that if I can communicate via email, it's a little bit better for me, and it makes it a little bit easier, and I feel a little bit more comfortable. And so, similarly, your partner and or who's ever reading it, they'll feel more comfortable if you're following their preferences. For other examples, does the partner need footnotes in a formal memo? Do you need to, when you cite to a case like Marbury versus Madison, do you need to explain what that means in a footnote? Do you need to cite cases or other documents to support your contentions? Do you need, for example, if you're talking about disparate treatment discrimination and you're talking about the McDonnell-Douglas test, do you need to include the case the McDonnell-Douglas case? Will that suffice? Do you need to include evidence to tack along and say we need to present this in the court? Do you know? Does the partner need a hard copy of your document, or will an attachment in email suffice? Or does the partner need both? Would they like both a hard copy and an attachment in email so they can use it as they're going along on the road? Now, if you're writing for a client, the style of your writing should reflect your client. Usually, clients aren't as versed in legalese. For example, you and I could probably converse about disparate treatment, responding at superior, theories of disparate impact. We could talk about treble, actual, punitive damages, consequential damages, and you and I could converse like that because we understand those words and we know the legal meanings behind that. However, probably for most clients, they are not as versed in the legalese. So, for example, while you might want to discuss theories of disparate treatment or responding at superior, and asking the court for a permanent injunction or treble, punitive, and actual damages in a letter to a client, it might not be as helpful to your client to use such language in the letter, at least without some explanation. If you absolutely have to include a legal phrase, I would recommend that you include some type of explanation for your client so they understand what that means. Some considerations. Instead of using the legal phrases, can you use what I like to call everyday language to express the same legal ideas? Or do you, as I said, do you absolutely need to include the legal phrases? For example, in our last example, can you say, we will sue your employer for discriminating against you based on your gender and ask the court to stop your employer from taking any further discriminatory actions and appropriately compensate you for your losses? So we had talked about disparate treatment discrimination, and disparate treatment discrimination is intentional discrimination based upon a protected characteristic, usually under federal law, state law. So instead of using the term disparate treatment, we're just going to actually say what it is, discriminating against you based on your gender. And something I like to talk about with my editors is when it comes to words like injunction. What does an injunction do? Well, an injunction basically halts, it stops, it prevents. So in that same idea, instead of trying to say we're going to look for a permanent injunction or a TRO or a preliminary injunction, can you say, well, we're going to try to stop your employer, conveying the same idea and from taking any further discriminatory actions, because that's what you're seeking. You're seeking an injunction to stop them from doing that and appropriately compensate you for your losses. Instead of trying to explain what actual, treble, punitive damages are, that might be easier in a face-to-face conversation with your client, but maybe when you're writing, you can just say, hey, we're going to seek compensation, the appropriate compensation for your losses. And that might trigger your client to come and say, hey, what kind of compensation are you looking for? And then you can talk about back pay, and you can talk about the available remedies to them. But it might be easier if you're just talking to your client to use everyday language that they're familiar with and that you can converse with them, and they'll better understand, and it'll resonate with them, rather than trying to use legal phrases and legal jargon. Now, if you're writing for a judge, the style of your writing should reflect the formality of the court and appropriate court rules. Do you know what the judge or court expects of your briefs or other formal pleadings or responses? And some considerations, if you want to find out, perhaps you can look at examples of documents for colleagues that were submitted to the judge or court that can guide your writing. Or, for example, you can go out onto Pacer, you can go into Justia, look up briefs that have been submitted to the courts, see what type of style that they use when they're submitting such information. Or perhaps you can talk to a legal assistant, you can talk to a partner, find out where you can get examples of how those documents were submitted to the court to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of idea of what type of style of writing is expected of you. Now, are there formal rules that you need to follow? For example, in the packet of information that was included, that was given to you, there is the Virginia court rules. So for mostly all courts, whether at the federal or state level, they all have some type of rules that guide documents that have to be submitted to the court. Do you know what those court rules are? It's absolutely imperative that you follow them. So seek them out. Now let's say you're writing an article for publication. Your style of writing should reflect the publication. And I'm sure in your career that as you grow, you want to write a publication for a law journal, maybe a legal magazine, maybe a newsletter, to kind of establish yourself as a subject matter expert. If you have chosen, let's say you've chosen to write about discrimination based on gender, and you want to find the right publication, do you read a publication often, and are you familiar with the types of articles it publishes? For example, in the equal employment opportunity world, you might have a journal that's dedicated to talking about management issues on one side that will look at discrimination from the employer perspective. But let's say you represent a plaintiff. You might not necessarily want to submit your article to that journal or that publication. You might want to be looking for a plaintiff's side journal, or perhaps you might want to look at journals that talk about women's issues. But you might not necessarily want to look in tax, or you might not want to look for science and technology, or perhaps you might even look at administrative law if you're talking about what's being done before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Basically, do you know your audience? Do you know who their audience is? Have you asked the publication for a style manual or guidelines? Almost all publications that I know have a style manual or guidelines. And sometimes they publish them online. They'll tell you, hey, we follow the Chicago Style Manual. Or no, we follow the AP Style Manual. Or this is the style that we follow. And I know that even if it's not there, you can probably contact them and ask them, what type of style manual or guidelines do you have? And I'm sure most of them will be happy to share that with you. And then finally, have you researched all the publications that could publish your article? Find the one that's the right fit for it. Whether it's an individual rights and responsibilities, dealing with discrimination based on gender, or whether you want to bring it up to a level to a labor and employment law article. Find one that fits. Take your time to find the right publication. And that brings us to our next step in the next phase of what I like to call the actual writing phase. And the second step for successful writing is to find your voice once you know who your audience is. When you begin writing, you should determine the appropriate tone of your writing and the focus of what you're writing about. Well, you say, that's great. That's kind of big and broad. But how do you find out what you should convey in any writing? How do you even start? Well, my first suggestion for you, a first guidepost, is to brainstorm. Before writing anything formal, jot down some ideas of what you might need or want to include in your writing. After writing down your ideas, begin to eliminate ideas that are extraneous or condense similar ideas down into one thought. For example, if you're writing a memo to your partner about disparate treatment discrimination based on gender in the workplace, you might be considering ideas like, well, what is employment discrimination based on gender? Are there different forms of gender discrimination? Am I following federal and or state anti-discrimination laws and regulations? Do I know what federal and or state anti-discrimination law and regulations that I need to follow? What actions do the employee and employer need to prove in an anti-discrimination case? Has the employee filed a complaint with the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission? Or has the employee complained in the workplace? Is there a formal complaint process in the workplace? What are the U.S. Supreme Court case precedents for gender discrimination? What are state case precedents for gender discrimination? How about EEOC rules? So here we're just kind of jotting down some ideas of thoughts of what we're going to try to convey in our writing. Now, once we've kind of jotted down all your thoughts and ideas, now you can go back and start to eliminate the extraneous ones that you don't need. Perhaps you are exclusively focused on state anti-discrimination law. Well, you might not need all the federal law. And start to eliminate and start to condense similar ideas. For example, those 10 or 12 questions that were brought up about thoughts of disparate treatment discrimination based on gender in the workplace, we might boil those down to about 3. 1, I need to review and explain all relevant federal and state employment anti-discrimination cases, laws, and regulations regarding discrimination based on gender. 2, I should determine how and what the client needs to prove that discriminatory actions were or were not taken based on gender in the workplace. And 3, I should inquire about any discrimination complaints that occurred in the workplace or were filed with federal or state EEO agencies. So now we've been able to kind of condense down and bring into focus what you want to write about to help guide you. Now the second guidepost, that after you finish brainstorming, no matter for whom you write, whether it's for your client, whether it's for an article, whether it's for a judge, whether it's for a partner, you should always start your writing by using an outline. Now, the outline could be formal, can be informal, depending upon your audience. You don't always need to have Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, A, B, C, little I, little 2, little 3. But, importantly, the outline should serve as the roadmap for your writing to get you to point A to point B. You should follow the outline that you create. For example, you're writing an article about writing for a publication. Now this, for an article, maybe for a newsletter, for even a blog, you could probably do something really informal, like bullet points. For example, 1, know your audience. 2, find your voice. 3rd bullet, follow the rules. And 4th, make time to review. And that might be all you need to get you to where you need to go. Now, for example, let's say you're writing a brief for a court. Your outline really might need to be more formal to ensure that you follow court guidelines and rules. For example, Roman numeral 1, know your audience. A, who is the direct audience to whom you are writing? Little 1, partner firm. Little 2, client. Little 3, judge. Little 4, publication. B, okay. If you have an A, you should always have a B. Same thing if you have a Roman numeral 1, you should have a Roman numeral 2. There are a few exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, if you have a 1, have a 2, have an A, have a B. Some considerations when writing for different audiences might be the B. Roman numeral number 2, find your voice. A, brainstorm. B, outline. C, remember the tone. And D, follow your roadmap. Well, now that you've established your roadmap for writing, you need to consider the tone of your writing before you put any pen to ink on your document. For example, are you arguing a specific point in your memo to the partner? Do you need to use strong, forceful words? It was blatant discrimination. Or maybe you're trying to gather more information from a hostile client, somebody who is not as friendly, doesn't really want to communicate with you. You might need to be a little more encouraging. So instead of saying, you need to get this to us ASAP, maybe you could say, we would really appreciate it if you would get this to us by January 15, 2013. So that way you're kind of softening the tone of your writing. And maybe that might resonate a little bit better with the client than using words that might be a little more harsh, such as you need to or we demand. You might not get it as better response if you use that type of a tone. Or, for example, are you filing a formal court document? Do you need to include appropriate legal language? So here, for example, let's go back to disparate treatment discrimination. The court is going to expect that you're going to use the theory of disparate treatment discrimination, and they're going to expect for you to discuss the McDonnell-Douglas case and the test. So they're going to expect that you're going to use the legal language, and you're going to want to do that so they know what you're talking about. So instead of disparate treatment, you're not going to talk about disparate impact discrimination. Well, counselor, what theory are you coming underneath before the court? So yes, you're going to want to use appropriate legal language when you're writing to the judge, but maybe not so much with the client. How you write your words is just as important as the construction of your document. always, always keep in mind your audience as you write. And the last suggestion and the last guidepost is, now that you've finished brainstorming, outlining, and considering the tone of your document, you can begin writing your document and using your voice by following the outline roadmap that you've created. Which brings us to the third step, and perhaps my favorite step: follow the rules. Yes, I know it's Friday morning, it's early, but this is the type of step that gets me excited as a copy editor. Following the rules, whatever you do, please, please follow the rules. And one of my favorite places to start is with grammar. When writing your document, you should pay attention to your grammar. Do not hesitate to consult grammar books or grammar websites when needed. As part of the information that was given for you for this class, we provided a list of various grammar websites, as well as some grammar books that you can purchase or you can take a look at. For example, one of my favorite websites is Grammar Girl. She has all these quick tips that you can just go out there. It takes you 5 minutes. And for example, is it either or, neither nor, that, which, who, colon, semicolon, comma? Not sure. There's so many grammar rules that sometimes it's easier to take the 5 minutes out. You're sitting in the cab, going to a client, click on your smartphone, go out to Grammar Girl. Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. It's either or, neither nor. Got it. Okay, takes just a couple of quick minutes. Or, for example, I always keep my little grammar book that I got in college. I also have my grammar book from law school. And you can just take them out, look it up. Ah, yes, neither nor, that's right. It's just as easy to do that. And the reason that I encourage you to do that is it makes it so much easier on the reader if you use good grammar. It is much more difficult to get through a document that is written poorly with bad grammar than it is to go through a document that is written with good grammar. It's much easier on your reader, and that's what you want to keep in mind. Know your audience. If you want to impress your partner, if you want to impress the publication, use good grammar. Now, what we're going to talk about next are just 3 good rules of thumb, 3 of the most important rules that I like to think about when you're writing. The first rule: use active and concise writing and avoid passive and superfluous writing. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's look at this first example here. He was going to go downtown tomorrow to participate in and be part of the event, period. He also was hoping that the traffic would not be too problematic and hard to handle. Does anybody know what's wrong with those sentences from the rule? Go ahead.
It's a passive voice.
Yes, you are absolutely right. He was going to go downtown to participate in, be part of the event. Second sentence, he also was hoping that the traffic would not be too problematic and hard to handle. Let's take a crack at making that a little more into an active voice. He is participating in the event downtown tomorrow and hoping that the traffic is not problematic. Can you see the difference here? He was going to go downtown to participate in. He is participating. It's a much more active voice. You're engaging the reader in what you're talking about. And you want to do that. You want to engage your reader. You want to keep them interested in what you've written. And in order to do that, use the active voice. Now, that's not to say there will be times where you will have to use the passive voice. It's going to happen. It will happen. But really strive to use the active voice. Now, let's talk about the superfluous words. There are 16 words in this first sentence. There's also 16 in this second sentence. Down here, we've cut those sentences in half. He is participating in an event downtown tomorrow. And up here we said to participate in and be part of the event. Isn't participating being part of the event? Do you really need to stop and think about the words that you use? Is it absolutely necessary that you have got to include all of those words in order to convey your point? Or can you just say, you know what, he's participating in an event downtown tomorrow. And here we said the traffic would not be too problematic and too hard to handle. Isn't problematic a problem? Do you really need to say too problematic in this instance? And hard to handle? I think for the most part, if you said that the traffic is not problematic, we know that he hopes it won't be a problem. So once again, we've condensed down from 16 to 8 words about participating in the event tomorrow. Once again, 16 words in the second sentence, down to another 8 words by simply saying he is participating in the event downtown tomorrow and hoping that traffic is not problematic. So we've been able to convey the exact same idea, yet in a much more active voice and being more concise. So really think about using the active voice in concise writing and avoiding the passive voice in superfluous writing. One of my second favorite rules, avoid run-on sentences. I see this all the time, whether in articles or whatever type of documents. I know as lawyers, we like to cram in as much information as we can in a sentence. I know that. But sometimes by doing that, you've made it more difficult for the reader to understand your point. For example, the traffic in Washington, D.C. metro area can give anyone a headache, and it is gridlocked from I-66 to I-495 every morning while I'm sitting in my car, flipping through the radio stations and sipping my coffee or eating my toast, but I think I should be paying more attention to the road, period. Okay, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Not only that, but for me, I have completely forgotten what was at the beginning of that sentence. All I can really remember by the end is that I need to be paying more attention to the road, because you've completely lost and disengaged your reader. And you don't want to do that. You want to engage your reader. But by having to make those mental hurdles to get from all these words, to get from the beginning of the sentence down to the period, that's a lot of work. So instead of trying to cram all those concepts and ideas, as great as they are, let's try to break them down into simpler sentences. Does anybody have a suggestion for an example of where you might break this up, to give a pause, to slow down the brakes? That's okay. I know it's early in the morning on Friday. Let's take a look at how we might break it up. The traffic in the Washington, D.C. metro area can give anyone a headache, period. Pause. Okay, my first concept. And that's really true. I mean, we are number 1 in the nation for the worst traffic. We've now earned that title. It is gridlocked from I-66 to I-495 every morning as I sit in my car flipping through radio stations, sipping my coffee, or eating my toast. Now, if any of you have ever had to travel from I-66 to I-495 in the Beltway first thing in the morning, you know what I'm talking about. It is gridlocked. It is going 2 miles an hour, and you very well might be flipping through your radio stations. You might be sipping your coffee. Sometimes I've seen people apply makeup, read a novel. I don't recommend that. But we've now entered a second concept. Okay, yep, traffic's a headache. For example, more specifically, from I-66 to I-495, sheer gridlock. And finally, my last sentence, but, I think I should be paying more attention to the road. That's probably true. So here what we've done is we've given some pauses, and we've allowed the reader to digest the materials that you're talking about. So that instead of having to make it through all those words at the beginning, you've now given them pauses where they can be like, okay, first sentence, understand. Second sentence, understand. Third sentence, yes, I understand the paragraph. So it helps to break it up instead of having to cram all of that information into one sentence. Now this is perhaps my favorite. Be judicious in your use of commas. And I'm going to give you just a couple of rules of thumb here. There are a bunch of rules dealing with commas. Once again, that's why these style manuals, your grammar books, grammar websites are so useful, is that you can go in there and find all the rules on commas. But let's talk about two of the most important ones. Use the comma to connect 2 independent thoughts or a list of 3 or more items. Please do not just throw in commas. Did I just lose the mic? Can you still hear me? Okay. Just don't throw in commas for comma's sake, and I see that a lot too. Now the problem with throwing in a bunch of commas is that now you're requiring your reader to stop, because that's what a comma does, is it stops the reader, makes them pause for a second to understand what you're writing. And you might not want them to always stop. You might want them to get the concept first and not have to make, once again, those mental hurdles of stopping every 2 seconds. What was those 2 words? Okay, another 3 words, stop, another 4 words, stop. It makes it a little erratic for the reader to understand the concept. It's much better to be judicious with your commas. Now, some good usage of commas. I do not like having to think about grammar as I write comma, but I do like writing sentences about commas, period. Okay. Does anybody know what this is an example of? It is 2 or more independent thoughts. Now, how do you know if you have 2 or more independent thoughts? I'm going to give you a real easy test that you can use and apply. Put your hand right over that comma but, okay? And let's go with the first part of that sentence. I do not like having to think about grammar as I write, period. You're going to throw a period in there. That is a complete thought. It's a complete sentence. Subject, verb, object, predicate. It's there. Now let's go to the second part. I do like writing sentences about commas, period. Once again, complete thought, complete idea, subject and verb. Now if you have that, go ahead, throw in your comma and conjunction, and, or, however, hitherto and forthwith. Go ahead, add it in. But make sure that you have 2 or more, you have 2 independent thoughts. Secondly, second good usage of commas. I need to borrow a pencil comma, eraser comma, pen comma, and paper to complete this writing exercise. Now this is what we kind of like to give it a term of serial commas, when you have 3 or more items in a list. And I will, I admit, you will see some styles of writing where they say, just do pencil comma, eraser comma, pen. Don't use that comma there before the and. It really depends on the style of writing. It depends on who your audience is. It depends on what their expectation is for your writing. But for the most part, as a good rule of thumb, if you have a list of 3 or more items, please include pencil comma, eraser comma, pen comma, and paper to complete this writing exercise. Now let's look at some bad usage of commas. She went to the store, comma, and bought a pen, comma, and paper. Does anybody know what's wrong with this sentence, with the commas?
The subject and the verb are separated by a comma. You can't have that.
Correct. Here we have the issue of no 2 independent thoughts, right? Let's do that test. Let's put her hand over that comma and the and. She went to the store, period. Oh, that's great. Subject, verb, complete sentence. However, let's go to that second part of the sentence. Bought pen and comma and paper. Absolutely correct. Where's the subject in bought a pen and paper? Who is the subject? Me, you, her, him. Well, really it was she. But what you've done is that you've made that pause without 2 independent thoughts. No need for a comma. Don't throw the comma in. Also, we have pen, comma, and paper. Here we only have 2 items. No need for an extra comma. Really, in reality, there's no need for any commas at all in this sentence. She went to the store and bought a pen and paper. Easy to understand, easy to read. And it's, as I said, it's just as simple for you as just to put that hand over that comma and conjunction. Do you have 2 independent thoughts by doing that? If you do, great. Use your comma. If you don't use the comma. Not needed. Okay, let's take a look at this one. He used a smartphone to text his friend, comma, around the clock. What's wrong with this? Exactly. Let's put that hand over the comma. He used his smartphone to text his friend. Period. Perfectly good sentence. Around the clock? No, not so much. Once again, here's another example. Comma, not needed. He used his smartphone to text his friend around the clock. So those are just 3 general rules of thumb. 1, use active voice and concise writing. Avoid the passive voice and superfluous writing. 2, avoid run-on sentences. And 3, be judicious in your use of commas. Now, you always want to remember your style manuals. Don't forget those. As you write your document, remember to do that, such as the Blue Book for proper citations. Do you have the most recent copy of the Blue Book? They often update that annually or every so often. Make sure you have it. Do you know if it's required to do the citations that way for the court, for your partner? Remember to follow the Blue Book. Also, consult legal dictionaries and regular dictionaries to understand concept and use the proper words. Now, there's something else that I like to keep on my desk. This is my little law dictionary that I got in law school. And when we run across legal phrases and words, it's always helpful to pull it out. Pull out your Black's Law Dictionary. For example, we talked about disparate treatment discrimination. Well, if we looked that up in Black's Law Dictionary, what does disparate treatment mean? The practice of intentionally dealing with persons differently because of their race, sex, national origin, age, or disability. So instead of having to write disparate treatment discrimination, we now understand what that means. It's intentional discrimination. And what type of intentional discrimination? Well, it's based on age, gender, disability, national origin, those protected characteristics under federal and state anti-discrimination law. But by looking it up in our legal dictionary, we now have a better idea and a better concept of what that is. Also, as we talked about earlier, if you're writing to a client or maybe a partner, you might have to explain those concepts. It might be absolutely necessary, but how do you explain it if you don't understand it? To help you understand it, pull out your law dictionary. Or, for example, you can even go below that, pull out the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. That's even a more basic concept. Let's say if you're talking to your client, you might want to be using everyday language. How do they explain it? Because a lot of people use Merriam-Webster's. Just go out on their website, find out how they define it. And that could be helpful and useful to you, especially when you're trying to explain legal concepts. Lastly, use a thesaurus to find impact words instead of using the same word throughout your document. For example, this presentation this morning was great. The speaker was great. The materials, they were great. Overall, it was a great experience. Okay, it's great. But what if you said, the presentation this morning was phenomenal. The speaker, she was stupendous, outstanding. The materials, they were exceptional. Overall, it was a great experience. Has a little bit more impact, doesn't it? Outstanding. Instead of saying great all the time, outstanding, terrific, stupendous, fantastic. Those are the types of terms that you might want to use in your documents instead of always using it was great, and that was great, and she was great, the whole thing was great. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to go to your thesaurus and pull out every archaic thesaurus word out there to use. I'm not advocating that. What I am talking about is just trying to find maybe other phrases that might help liven up your document just a little bit. Now, if you're filing court documents, once again, always consult the federal, state, or local rules for filing your documents. Make sure you know what they are, and make sure that you're following them. Which brings us to the 4th step for successful writing. We've now gone through, we now knew our audience, we now have found our voice, and we are following the rules. Another favorite topic that I do like to talk about, and one that I think is not always discussed a whole lot, is what I call the post-writing phase. Make time to review. This is perhaps an understated and often overlooked part of writing, is what happens after you finish writing your document. The time you take to review and edit your work is key to the success of your writing. It really is. Even if you only have 10 minutes before your document is due. And this is especially important in our electronic age. I think it's fabulous that we have Microsoft Word, we have WordPerfect, our Gmail accounts have grammar check, spell check for you. I think it's fabulous. However, there are items that those grammar checks and those spell checks will not catch. For example, let's say you are arguing your case on disparate treatment discrimination, and as you're writing your brief, you say disparate impact. Now, if you've written that correctly, spell check's not going to catch that, and you've submitted it to the court. And the court might be puzzling, thinking, you're arguing disparate treatment, you're using the McDonnell-Douglas case, you're looking at adverse impact, but wait a second, why are you talking about disparate impact? Those are two separate theories. You do not want to be arguing the one if it's really the other. But once again, that's not going to be caught by your spell check, not by your grammar check. Or for example, let's say your client's name is Nancy, and as you're writing along, your other client's name is Nathaniel. You put in Nathaniel's name. Now let's say you send that letter off to opposing counsel, and they're looking and they're thinking, well, who's Nathaniel? I know Nancy. I don't know Nathaniel. But once again, your grammar check, your spell check, not going to pick that up if you've written it correctly. Not at all. And maybe the last and perhaps most important is, let's say that when you're suing for $500,000. You want $500,000. But let's say when you're writing, you accidentally delete 2 of the zeros, and it says 5,000, and you submit that document. Boy, that's a problem, isn't it? Now you're only seeking $5,000 instead of $500,000. Oh yeah, we'll accept that, no problem. Here's a $5,000 check for you. But once again, if you've written that correctly, grammar check, spell check, not going to pick that up. That's why it is absolutely critical that you take the time to review your document with your own eyes. Well, you say, that's great, but I'm not a copy editor. I don't do this for a living. How do I edit my own work? In the packet of information that you were given for this session, there is an article entitled Edit Your Own Work in 5 Steps. And I want to take you through it. The first step in editing your work is to put it away. I mean, even if you only have 10 minutes, can you put it away for one? Just one. What this does is it allows you to disengage from your document, because you've been working on that so hard that you are so familiar with it, you might not be able to catch small little inconsistencies, such as and your client. But your brain might think and your client, but you've really written it twice, and maybe your grammar check hasn't picked that up. But if you can disengage for at least a minute, it gives you an opportunity to come in with fresh eyes. Perhaps you can put it away for an hour, even a day, better yet. Fantastic. Or maybe you're writing for a publication and you can put it away for a week. Give yourself the time to disengage from what you're writing, to be able to come back with fresh eyes and to read your document and maybe be able to catch those mistakes. Number 2, edit for content. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means what we talked about before. If you really meant to say disparate treatment and you wrote disparate impact, check to make sure that it's disparate treatment throughout your document. If you really meant to say Nancy and not Nathaniel, make sure you have your client's name right. Make sure you have the amount of money that you're seeking right. This is your first review that you're just going through. Check out your content. Now, once you've gone through and you've edited for content, you're going to go back again. This time you're going to edit for style. This is where you're going to make sure you've crossed your T's, dotted your I's, make sure that your document has the right margins, make sure the spacing is correct, does it need page numbers, are your footnotes correct, have you followed all the court rules? You're not even worried about content because you've already done that. You've already taken that step. So no need to worry, you've corrected all of that. Now you're going back through and you're just going to look at the style for it. First step, don't forget the spelling and the grammar. Yes, please go ahead. Do use the spell check. Do use the grammar check. I'm not advocating against that. Absolutely. They're very helpful and very useful tools. But something else to consider is something I've noticed and I've done myself is that as I've used a spell check, sometimes you just go so fast and you have a word that says and it's and is spelled incorrectly and you meant to say and, but you press at. You're just going so fast that you press the wrong one. And the Microsoft Word will say, oh yeah, that's correct. So your sentence says at your client, and you meant and your client. But it's correct. So be careful as you're clicking through and you're pressing it, yes, no, right. Same thing with grammar. Microsoft Word often likes to give you grammar suggestions that might not fit your style of writing. And if you click it, they'll think that it's the right grammar. But you're not necessarily meaning to do that. So be very careful as you're using the spell checks and the grammar checks. But please certainly do that. And lastly, find a second pair of eyes. Now this is kind of optional. It's an optional step because sometimes you might be up against a deadline, and trust me, I understand deadlines. And if you're up against a deadline, you might not always have time to find a second pair of eyes. But I highly recommend it if you can. For example, if you're working on a brief, maybe you have a colleague who's also working on it as well. Maybe they can read through it. Maybe your legal assistant can read through it. Because sometimes they're able to catch things. Once again, you've been so engaged in your document that you might not catch all those and yours or period, or you forgot to capitalize something. You're just so familiar with the topic that you think it's all correct. But somebody else coming in with a fresh set of eyes, they also might be able to point you out in areas that you might not even consider. For example, they might say, well, what does that mean? Oh, well, if this person is questioning what it means, maybe I need to take a second look at it and figure out what does that mean? Am I correctly talking about a certain topic? So having a second pair of eyes is always helpful, if you can. And with that, we've now come to the conclusion of our journey for successful writing. And, once again, going back to my journey from Central Texas to Chicago and remembering the guideposts along I-69 in Oklahoma and the midway point in Joplin, Missouri, knowing that I was almost halfway home, and then hitting Springfield, knowing I was about 3.5 hours from my destination, and finally hitting I-355, I knew I was home. Well, this morning, hopefully I've been able to give you some steps along your journey in writing to help you have successful writing. 1, know and figure out who your audience is. 2, find your voice, the tone of your document, the focus of it. Brainstorm, outline, condense the ideas down. Remember the tone. Use the outline as your roadmap. 3, follow the rules. Please follow the rules. Use good grammar. Absolutely. Use style manuals. Be judicious with your commas. Use the active voice. And lastly, make time to review. Take the time needed to have that second fresh set of eyes to help you have and create a successful document. Thank you so much. Are there any questions at all?
Yes. Why did the media start calling it pleaded instead of pled? He pleaded guilty, and it makes me nuts.
I think because the media, we make our own style rules. Okay. So we might, for example, the AP, they might pick up, and it also could be just how people talk. For example, you know that in the dictionaries, that they will pick up the latest jargon out there, IMing, texting, and they'll add it to the dictionary. It might be just how we talk and converse and saying he pleaded guilty, and they might pick that up and decide in the AP style manual that's the correct terminology for pleading. So that very well could be why that they say pleaded instead of pled.
Some of us older ones know.
Anybody else?
Any questions here in Richmond?
Oh, yes.
I'm not having any, so we're good to go. Thank you very much, Rachel. We'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene in 11.